We're going to cover the cardiac cycle in this lecture. The cardiac cycle is what happens in one heartbeat, and it's going to be divided into two stages. We have systole and diastole. Systole means contraction, and diastole means relaxation. There is systole and diastole for both the atria and the ventricles, but we're going to be focusing on systole and diastole in the ventricles since that's what really pumps the blood around the body. As far as which one lasts longer, the heart is going to spend more time in diastole. So it spends more time relaxing and filling up with blood, and then systole, the contraction phase, will be shorter. So remember that blood likes to flow from areas of high pressure to low pressure, and the valves are going to be opening just by themselves just because of the difference in the pressure gradients. And then I have here listed when the AV valves are open and when the semilunar valves are open, and we'll go through that as we go through the cardiac cycle. There are 4 phases of the cardiac cycle, so make sure you star these in your notes. This is really important to know. So the first phase is called ventricular filling, and it occurs in mid to late diastole. So both the atria and ventricles are relaxed, and the pressure is higher in the atria than it is in the ventricles, so the AV valves will be open, and blood will be flowing in and filling up the ventricles. So that's why it got the name ventricular filling. Both of the semilunar valves are closed, and that's because the pressure is higher in the aorta and the pulmonary artery than it is in the ventricles. And this is just a nice picture just showing you kind of looking at the top of the heart here, and looking down you can see that during ventricular filling phase both the AV valves are open, so blood will flow from the atria into the ventricles, and then both of these semilunar valves are closed. The second phase of the cardiac cycle is called isovolumetric contraction. And if you look at the word isovolumetric, remember iso means the same. So the blood volume in the ventricle is going to stay the same even though the ventricle has started to contract. So this will occur in early systole. So as the ventricle starts to contract, it increases the pressure inside the ventricle, which now makes it higher than the atria. So that will close both AV valves. But the pressure in the ventricle is not high enough yet to open the semilunar valves. So during isovolumetric contraction, all 4 valves are closed and there's no blood entering or leaving the ventricles. So that's why it's called isovolumetric. The third phase of the cardiac cycle is called ventricular ejection, and this occurs in mid to late systole. So the ventricles continue contracting, the pressure gets higher inside the ventricle, and now it's high enough that it opens the semilunar valves and blood is now ejected out into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So this is just a picture looking at the top of the heart again during the ventricular ejection phase. So you can see that both AV valves are closed because the ventricles are contracting. The pressure is much higher in the ventricles than the atria. And then the semilunar valves are both open because the pressure is much higher in the ventricle than it is in the aorta and the pulmonary artery. And the last phase of the cardiac cycle is called isovolumetric relaxation, and it occurs in early diastole. So as the ventricle relaxes, the pressure will decrease, so both semilunar valves will close, but the pressure in the ventricle is still higher than what's in the atria, so the AV valves are still closed. So all 4 valves are closed during isovolumetric relaxation, so no blood will enter or leave the ventricles, and that's why it's called isovolumetric. And this is just a picture just showing you the 4 phases of the cardiac cycle. So the first phase, we have ventricular filling over here on the left, and the ventricles are relaxed, they're in diastole. So the blood is flowing from the atria through the open AV valves and filling up the ventricles. The semilunar valves are closed. And then isovolumetric contraction occurs as the ventricles start to contract and the pressure increases in the ventricle. That will close both the AV valves, but the pressure in the ventricle is not high enough to open the semilunar valves. So all 4 valves are closed during isovolumetric contraction and no blood enters or leaves the ventricles. So that's why it's called isovolumetric. And then as the ventricles continue to contract, their pressure becomes high enough that they open both the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves, and blood will be ejected out into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. The pressure is still higher in the ventricles than in the atria, so the AV valves are closed. So just the semilunar valves are open during ventricular ejection. And then once systole is done, the ventricles relax, enter into diastole, and then they go into isovolumetric relaxation phase. So as they relax, the pressure decreases in both ventricles. It's now less than what's in the pulmonary artery and the aorta, so both semilunar valves are closed. But the pressure in the ventricles is higher than what's in both atria, so the AV valves will be closed. So all 4 valves are closed and no blood is entering or leaving the ventricles during isovolumetric relaxation. And then I've just classified them as far as which phase is occurring during diastole and which ones are occurring during systole. This graph is really important to know, so make sure you star this in your notes. The pink line is showing you the atrial pressure, and the green line is showing you the pressure inside the ventricles. So we'll start in diastole over here on the left, and this is the ventricular filling phase. So notice that the atria pressure is higher than what's in the ventricles, so the AV valves are open, and blood is flowing in and filling up the ventricles. And as the ventricles fill up with blood, their pressure will increase. At the end of ventricular filling, there's a little bump here, and that's where the atria contract and finish filling up the ventricles. And then at this pink arrow, this is where systole starts. So the ventricles contract, their pressure quickly becomes higher than what's in the atria, so the AV valves will close. And in this narrow strip here, the pressure in the ventricles is not high enough to open the semilunar valves, so all 4 valves are closed, and this is the isovolumetric contraction phase. And then once we reach this blue line, then the pressure in the ventricles is high enough to open the semilunar valves, and now we're in the ventricular ejection phase. So we're squirting blood out into the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. And notice at the end here, the pressure in the ventricles drops a little bit. The ventricles are still contracting, but there's not a lot of blood left in the ventricles, so that will decrease the pressure. And then this next blue line is where diastole starts again. So the ventricles relax, their pressure becomes less than what's in the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, so the semilunar valves close. And in this narrow strip, the AV valves are still closed as well because the ventricle pressure is still higher than what's in the atria. So this little strip is isovolumetric relaxation phase. And then we get to the bottom here, and the pressure in the ventricles drops below the atria, and then we'll start the ventricular filling phase again. So the AV valves will open, and we'll start filling the ventricles with blood again and then start the cycle again. This graph is also really important to know, so make sure you star this one, and we'll see it again in chapter 14. So it's showing you the green line is the ventricular pressure, and the blue line is showing you the pressure inside the aorta. So notice that during diastole, the ventricular filling phase, so the ventricles are not contracting, they're not pushing any blood out into the aorta, so the blood that's in the aorta is leaving, and notice that the pressure inside the aorta is dropping. And so this lowest point we get to, that's called the diastolic pressure. Okay, and that happens at the end of diastole. But then the ventricle enters into systole, contracts, and its pressure becomes higher than what's in the aorta, and that will open up the semilunar valves. So this is ventricular ejection phase that's going on here. So the ventricles are squirting blood out into the aorta, filling them up with blood, and so the pressure will become a lot higher in the aorta as it fills with blood. And so the highest pressure that's reached, that is the systolic pressure. And then at the end here of ventricular ejection phase, notice that the pressure starts to drop in the aorta a little bit along with the ventricle, and that's because the ventricle doesn't have a lot of blood left in it that it's squirting out into the aorta, so that will drop. And then the pink line is when diastole starts, the ventricle relaxes, so its pressure quickly becomes less than what's in the aorta, so that will close the semilunar valves. When the semilunar valves close, there's some turbulence in the blood flow, and so there's this little dip here called a diacritic notch. And then this is all diastole again, where the ventricles are relaxing, refilling with blood, and notice that the blood that was squirted out into the aorta is leaving, going out to the rest of the body, and then you finally get to the lowest pressure again, the diastolic pressure. We're going to talk about the mean arterial pressure in the next chapter, but the mean arterial pressure is just a weighted average between the systolic and the diastolic pressure. This graph is also really important to know, so make sure you star this one too. It's showing you the volume of blood that's in the ventricle. So at the end of diastole, at the end of ventricular filling, the end diastolic volume, that's the highest amount of blood that's in the ventricle. And then at the end of systole, at the end of contraction, this is our end systolic volume. This is the amount of blood left in the heart at the end of contraction. So notice that the end systolic volume is not 0. It's about 60 mils, so you never squeeze out all of the blood from the heart. There's always a little bit left in there. And then we want to know how much blood did we squeeze out with one beat. So that's called your stroke volume. And to figure out the stroke volume, you're just going to take your end diastolic volume, which is 130 mils, subtract your end systolic volume, the 60 mils, and we get a stroke volume of 70 mils per beat. So that just means that that ventricle pumped out 70 mils of blood with each contraction. You can also listen to heart sounds with a stethoscope. There's 2 heart sounds described as lub-dub. The first heart sound is a little bit softer, the lub, and it occurs at the start of systole when the ventricles start to contract and the AV valves close. And you're not actually hearing the valves slamming shut, you're just hearing the turbulence in the blood flow that occurs when the valves close. The second heart sound is the louder dub, and it occurs at the start of diastole, or when the ventricles start to relax. And that's when the semilunar valves close, they create turbulence in blood flow, and that creates the second heart sound. We can also hear a heart murmur. These are abnormal sounds that we hear during the cardiac cycle. This is just showing you when we hear the heart sounds. So here's our first heart sound, the softer lub that occurs at the start of systole as the AV valves close. And then here's the louder second heart sound, the dub, that occurs at the start of diastole as the semilunar valves close. And then I've also got some videos here that give you the heart sounds, and I'll play them for you. So we're going to listen to a normal heart sound first. So I want you to listen for the lub-dub, the 2 heart sounds. Okay, and now we're going to listen to a heart murmur. Okay, and I want you to listen to this one. We've got a valve that's leaking, and so some of the blood is flowing backwards where it should not be, and so it creates this swishing noise. So let's listen to this heart murmur. So you notice that swish. Okay, that's the sound of a heart murmur. And there's different ones that occur in different locations depending on which valve is affected.